guys, welcome to another episode of The Floor is Yours. My name is Suryansh Basumalik. I will be serving as your moderator, but this time I will not just be serving as your moderator, but I will also be debating because at the last minute, one of our speakers had to pull out. So, as a compromise, I will be moderating and debating. So, our judge for today's debate is returning once again, Ishan Banerjee, who has debated with us as well. Welcome back, Ishan. Our speakers from the proposition are Anirudh, who will be speaking first, Arav, who will be speaking second, and Pradyum third, and Ave fourth for their side. And for the opposition, it will be Shinjoy Sen, Aditya Raj Paul, Ranak Banerjee, and yours truly. I will not be judging, I will simply be moderating. Right now, with that being said, each speaker will get 4 minutes to speak, and after discussing with Ishan, only the first speaker of the proposition will get a chance to sum up his argument at the end in order to give him a chance to rebut. Therefore, with that being said, the first speaker for today's debate is Anirudh Chaudhary. Anirudh, are you there?
Yeah, so I would like to divide my time in two and two, like 2 minutes for my first
Yeah,
speech and
all
2
right.
minutes.
Okay. So Anirudh, for the first 2 minutes of your speech, the floor is yours.
Yeah. The House believes rioting reduces effectiveness of protest. And I, being the lead speaker of side proposition, it is my utmost prerogative to prove to you how true and valid the motion really is. So let us first define rioting. Rioting is a violent disturbance of the peace by a crowd. It primarily includes shooting, killing, or use of fire. And let us now understand the purpose of protest. A protest is a way of making opinions publicly to influence other public opinions or government policy. This leads in bringing about desired changes in laws or social customs. And when there is rioting, people forget the actual purpose of the protest and their attention is drawn towards the violence aspect of the rioting. They ask questions like how many people were killed rather than asking what's the purpose of the protest. So this naturally reduces the effectiveness of the protest. And furthermore, protests symbolize power and they're capable of bringing about people violence or rioting. Power of people's voices are not capable of bringing about change and therefore they need to be cushioned by rioting. So this automatically again brings down the effectiveness of protest. And for example, ladies and gentlemen, the rebellion of 1857, which was enormous protest, but it successful just because it was violent. And for example, the salt march started by Mahatma Gandhi, enormous lot of people joined and it was successful just because it was peaceful. That's my case, and with this I was very proud to propose.
Right. With that being said, we have come to the end of the first 2 minutes of your speech with a pinpoint ending. Thank you, Anirudh. Now, because I will be a moderator, I will be a debater as well. I would request Ishan to recognize a certain number of speakers for.
Right. Anyone has any questions? Suryansh, Chinja.
Right. May I ask my question?
Yeah.
Right. Now, Anirudh, at the very end of this first part of your speech, you mentioned the example of Mahatma Gandhi and his protest and his rise in India, right? Now, although it wasn't a violent riot, it also it also before him people like Bhagat Singh were there, and for the very example of Mahatma Gandhi himself put himself under mass starvation. He encouraged multiple people to follow with him, and at the same time, he exercised in very unlawful practices, which included laying in bed with under 18 children who were little girls, and called it resistance from the urge of intercourse. Now, with that being said, uh, peaceful
Today, wrap up.
right last with main question. Now, with that being said, do you think that peaceful protests are also allowing protesters to also uh, create unrest within the protesting crowds?
So basically, your question is that peaceful protests are allowing a huge conflict between the Protestants. That's what your question is. What's your? Can you please specify your question?
Right. So, in simple, protesters like Mahatma Gandhi during this time had engaged in very unlawful practices, like I mentioned earlier.
Hmm.
Now, with that being said, because it is peaceful and much light isn't shed on it by the state, because it is peaceful and there is nothing that is directly affecting the state. They do
Hmm.
not actually. The British Raj did not really look to see what was actually going on within the people, because they didn't really care, and
Hmm.
it allowed people like Gandhi to exploit women and exploit multiple people who had blind faith in him. Now, don't you think that peaceful protest allow such things, and won't violent protest allow them to directly approach the government?
Hmm. Okay. So at the very offset, I would like to say that you mentioned that people like Mahatma Gandhi exploited little women. So, sir, this is your personal belief. We don't have any solid proof of such. And furthermore, would you give more weightage to 20 women being killed or 20 women being sexually exploited? So I would rather say that killing of 20 women is of greater damage than 20 little exploiting 20 little girls, and therefore I see that it is just a personal opinion which raises such a question, and there has been no solid proof of such. Thank you.
Thank you.
Am I allowed to follow up?
No, no, no. Sorry, no. Pradyum, Shinja, you had a question, right?
Right. So you sir, so in your speech, you limited your example specifically to India, where you claim that peaceful protests are what led to freedom, and violent measures like the First War of Independence in 1857 did not help. But sir, again, if you look at freedom movements from African countries like Kenya or even the French Revolution, if you may, it is violent movements in these cases which actually brought about the regime change. So why do you think that just because it might not have worked in India, it will not work anywhere?
Sir, as far as French Revolution is concerned, it was not that revolution not only took place because of the violent actions that were taking place in the public. It was because of the millions of peaceful protests and the influence of great writers and poets of those times that revolution was the revolution actually took place. So it is not only the violent protests that cause a revolution to take place. It is actually the peaceful and more simplified way of influencing people's mind that causes a revolution to take place. So I think peaceful protests should be given more weightage as compared to violent protests, and that is what the house should believe.
Yeah, Aditya Raj, I have a question, Anirudh, for you.
Yeah.
Uh, tell me, uh, tell me, what do you mean by rebellion, riots, and protests?
What I mean by, sir, I very clearly mentioned that when I say
No, no, no.
rioting, it
I don't want to know what you mentioned in your speech. I want to know what your opinions are on rebellion, rioting, and protesting. What are these three concepts?
okay.
Since you mentioned the rebellion of 1857,
Yeah.
tell me what these three things mean.
As a whole, or three things differently.
Thank you. We can move on, Suryansh.
Right.
I have a question.
No, no, no. Thank you. Not this one.
Right. Now, with that being said, thank you for your speech, Anirudh. We will now be moving on to the mainstream speeches, which is starting with Shinjoy Sen. Shinjoy, are you with us?
Yes.
Right. Shinjoy, you have 4 minutes on the clock. The floor is yours.
Right. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are living in an age where violent protests and beheadings of the kings and queens of a certain regime are qualified as peaceful protests so long as certain authors or poets had written a few poems about them, or at least that is what the first speaker of side proposition feels. A very good morning to one all present here. Today, the motion under fire today reads: This House believes that rioting reduces the effectiveness of protests, and as a member of side opposition, I will prove to you just how completely invalid today's motion truly is. Now, I would like to begin my speech by defining not only the keywords present in today's motion, but also a few related keywords that I feel will be very important in our tackling of today's motion. Firstly, a protest. A protest is a statement or action expressing objection to something. A riot is a violent disturbance of the peace by a crowd, and as a rebellion, as already asked by our judge, is an act of armed resistance to an existing government or a leader. Now we must understand that this act of armed resistance to an established government or leader counts as a violent disturbance of the peace of a crowd, and a violent disturbance of a peace of crowd may be an expression of the disapproval or objection to something. Therefore, a rebellion Therefore, we can say that riots are parts of rebellion which are in essential protests. Now, ladies and gentlemen, something that I would like you to note regarding today's motion is that it simply says that this House believes that rioting reduces the effectiveness of protests. It does not say that rioting sometimes reduces the effectiveness of protests, or rioting maybe reduces the effectiveness of protests, but simply that rioting reduces the effectiveness of protests. Therefore, in today's debate, if side opposition can bring out even one case study in which rioting has not been able to reduce the effectiveness of protests, in that case, the motion will automatically have fallen. For example, if the motion says the sun rises in the west, in the east, and we can bring out even one case in which the sun rises in the west and sets in the east, then the motion automatically falls. Therefore, I present to you the women's suffrage movement. This is a movement in which violence was endorsed as not as a necessary tactic and an essential tactic to get women the rights that they deserved. And 100 years down, and so many years down the line, we can see that this actually resulted in them getting the voting rights in Britain and other countries all over the world. We can safely say that this protest was a success, and we can also safely remark that the use of rioting in these protests did not in any way, shape, or form reduce the effectiveness of these protests. Again, we must consider the multitude of African nations like Kenya and all who have broken free from their colonial chains as a result of violent measures. These are, in essence, rebellions which result from riots, that is a violent disturbance of the peace by a crowd, because any rebellion whatsoever would lead to this disturbance, right? Even if we look at the Indian freedom struggle, the previous speaker before me may have tried to whitewash the efforts of every great Indian ruler like Bhagat Singh, Khudiram Bose, and all the leaders in the 1857 movement, Subhash Chandra Bose, and has focused just on Gandhi. But we must understand that while effective, Gandhi was not the only factor responsible for British giving over freedom to India. It has also been widely remarked by many scholars that Britain were pressured by America because the World War II was formed to free countries
Gonna
from
wrap up.
colonialism, and also that the British after World War II were not in an economic state to hold on to so many colonies. Therefore, we must remark that these
Enjoy wrapping
violent
up.
protests, yes, wrapping up, have played just as much as role of a role here. Also, I would like to point out that the first speaker has said that to influence government policy, if we use riots in our protests, then the focus will be changed to how many have died, instead of the focus being on whether the change has actually taken place. But I must remark that these protests are not always to
Wrap up,
influence
Enjoy.
government policy, but sometimes also to
Enjoy. You
overthrow the
passed the
current
time by
regime.
about almost a minute now.
Thank you. My apologies. I've wrapped
Right.
up.
Now, with that, we will now, Shan. You may recognize questions.
There are any questions? Pradyum followed by any questions? Okay. Yeah, Pradyum.
Okay, so in your speech, you mainly gave examples of how governments were overthrown. So, in your speech, you spoke about rebellion and revolutions. You didn't speak about protests. Protests seem to bring about a change in the system. revolutions try to overthrow the system. So the motion today reads, rioting reduces the effectiveness of protests. So how does your speech justify that rioting increases the effectiveness of protest?
Thank you, sir. Considering that I spent the entire first 2 minutes of my speech bringing out the connection between a riot and a protest, I feel extremely disappointed at having this question presented before me. Now, as I've already brought out, the word protest, as defined in the Oxford Dictionary, is a statement or action expressing objection to something. A riot is a violent disturbance of the peace by a crowd. Now, I'm sure that we will all agree that this violent disturbance of the peace in the crowd that happened during the 1857 revolution, as well as the other examples given by me, were in order were in essence an action that expressed an objection to the oppressiveness of the British. Therefore, a riot or a rebellion in this case was actually a form of protest against the oppressiveness of the British.
Sanjay, yeah. Okay. Thank you. Abhay, your
Yeah,
question.
so my question is that your first example was about the women's suffrage movement. And you said that just because the women's suffrage movement was a success, that means that rioting did not reduce the effectiveness of the protest. How do you bring about that connection? Just because a movement succeeded doesn't mean that every single tactic employed in that movement is the reason that movement was a success.
Right. Fair enough. And so thank you for your question. So now, so if you actually research into the women's suffrage movement, as I'm sure you already have, you would find out that this tactic, this necessary or essential tactic of violence that I spoke about, was not just any tactic employed by them, but one of the most important tactics employed by them. And you will receive several articles written by the Guardian and other such authentic websites which will tell you about how essentially it is these tactics itself which led to the women's suffragette movement succeeding.
May I follow up?
No, thank you. Suyansh, yeah, we're done with.
Yeah, sorry, my internet. Yeah. Right now, now that there are no follow-ups and no more questions left, we will move on to the next speech, which is from the proposition represented by Arav now. Arav Midha, are you with us?
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes, you are. Arav, you
Yeah,
have 4 minutes on the clock. You may begin.
all right. So, good evening, everyone. Topic placed before us reads that this House believes that rioting reduces the effectiveness of protests. And I, being a member of Team Proposition, will prove to you how true and valid this topic really is. So, what is rioting? Rioting is something which takes place in a country or in a particular place where a group of people react violently to a change in the present political or social scenario in the country and want to bring about some change. So we need to understand that governments all around the world prefer and agree to peaceful methods of protest over a more violent approach. And if these protests turn violent, the government is forced to take up stringent methods to neutralize the situation which is unfolding. And this very often involves police action or mass arrests. An example of this is the Tiananmen Square protest in China, in which a large number of Chinese students and civilians to protested for change. They wanted a voice in the government. They wanted a say in what the government was ruling. These protests, as a result, turned violent and led to a massive government crackdown, resulting in deaths, injuries, property damage, and in the end, no effect, no major effect was taken out from these riots. So now, as the first speaker of side opposition said, the suffragette movement was a violent movement. We need to understand there have been very, very, very few cases of violence that has been reported as a part of this movement, and only about few cases of arson were reported as part of this movement, which is dwarfed by by how peaceful and how effective this entire pro movement was. and it is often social change which eventually leads to legal action. And with this ideology in hand, peaceful protests all around the world often focus on informing the people about what is right and what is wrong. And as a result, governments often give in to this change and often agree to the demands of the protesters. So the suffragette movement in Britain, which originated in Britain and moved on to the USA, resulted in the woman attaining the right to vote, and which this is a widely successful movement, which led to the growth of several other peaceful protests around the world, which fought against unjust laws which the lawmakers had imposed upon the people, and which resulted in a better political scenario in the country where the people were living. Peaceful protests are much more effective to bring about change in society, as governments are often sympathetic to these protesters. And this often leads to successful changes in the scenario in the country and the region, making our world a better place to live in. Thank you.
Right. Arav, you have about 50 seconds left. Would you like to carry on, or can we wrap up?
Yeah, we could wrap up.
Right. All right. With that, we will now be taking questions on Arav's speech. Ishan. Right. I think Ishan's.
Shinjoy and Ranak.
Shinjoy.
Instead of a question, can pointing out a fallacy or a fact fallacy be allowed?
Is it about the women's suffragette?
It's about Tiananmen Square, man.
Yes, I had one too actually.
Ah, exactly.
Yeah. Fine.
I mean, considering this is not an MUN and you don't have point of orders in debates.
Okay,
will
then it's cool. I
include
don't
in
have
your
a
have a
speech.
question.
I don't
Ishan.
know.
Include in your speech. Yeah, okay. Sorry, you have a question.
Right. Shinjoy.
Sorry, followed by
Wasn't it recognized already?
Yeah, Shinjoy can go first.
yeah, Shinjoy. Okay, Shinjoy.
Right. So it's a twofold question. So, firstly, sir, you stated that if the protests turn violent, governments are forced to take up stringent measures to curb these protests. But in recent days, we are also seeing governments take up stringent measures to curb protests that are non-violent, like the recent protests that are happening in the United States of America are being curbed by tear gas. So, how do you respond to that, firstly? And secondly, you stated how the women's suffragette has led to many peaceful movements all over the world, and that was one of the main axes of your speech today. But I've already stated in my speech referencing articles from the Guardian about the amount and necessity of violence used in the women's suffragette movement. Again, how do you respond to these fallacies?
Right. Answering your question first, the riots in America were violent in several states across the country. They looted stores, they burned down police buildings, and all of these are essentially crimes which are illegal to perform. If you burn down a building during a protest, and if you burn down a building in normal life, there's no difference from the law perspective of it. However, these acts often go unnoticed during protests as people are more focused on the ulterior motive towards behind these protests. And to could you repeat your second question, please?
Right, sir. Can I have a follow up on the first one as well? I feel it's very pertinent.
Shinjoy, the second question. Asking your.
Can I just ask the first question again? If because
Okay. Then your second question is stands nullified.
fair enough, sir. So, okay, so I'm sacrificing my second question for a follow up on the first one. So, sir, you said how there have been looting in certain of these protests, therefore, all of these protests should be curbed with stringent measures. What do you have to show on reports that have been verified by several authentic websites as well as several celebrities that the president used tear gas on peaceful protesters outside White House just so he could have a photo op? I'm sure all of you have heard this report. What is the justification to that stringent curbing of a non-violent protest?
All right. So, considering that this protest was outside the White House, and the White House houses a very high security and a high profile person, so considering that these protesters might have been a threat to the president and might have injured the president in any way or form, the law enforcement authorities deemed it safe or deemed it correct to neutralize these protests with tear gas. I believe I've answered your question.
Right. Ishan, can I ask my question?
Yeah, you can. Go on.
Right. Now, Arav, while Ishan has asked me to put aside your brutal misrepresentation of the Tiananmen Square massacre, I would like to ask you how you believe Tiananmen Square was a failure, considering how it brutally, how it, with after those brutal deaths, how it changed the course of Chinese events forever. Because as everyone here knows, the people protested because they were dissatisfied by the way the government was running the economy. And after those protests, the Chinese government was pressured and were morally condemned by the international community after the Tiananmen Square massacre. And the Chinese government had changes, leaps and bounds worth of changes, and excelled for
Yes.
the better. Yeah, I
Well
would
said.
simply like to ask him how he could justify this.
Right. So these changes that were brought about within the Chinese, the form of government, were imposed after the current leader was changed. So we need to take a note of the change in leadership which occurred, and the change in leadership also resulted in a change in perspective and a change in the way of how a country would be governed, and also in a way of allowing people to do things which the previous leader had not allowed. So yeah, that's
Right,
what
Ishan, can I point out something to you?
Message.
Right, all right.
Yeah. Okay. Let's move forward.
Right. Now, with that being said, um,
Yeah.
we
Point
will
noted.
now be moving to the next speaker, which is Aditya Raj Paul. Aditya, are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay, you have 4 minutes. The floor is yours.
Well, the House believes that rioting reduces the effectiveness of protest. So we must realize that riots emerge out of protest. In the recent times, be it the NRC protest or the George Floyd protest, everything it started with peaceful protest, with people marching down the lanes with placards or raising their voices. It is in both of these cases, it is when these protests met military or police resistance that they developed into violent measures, and it turned into a riot because no one in their right minds would like to destroy their own communities, taking into mind that all these protests happen within the area in which the Protestants live. And hence, since riots emerge out of protests, it's very illogical to say that it uh, reduces the effectiveness of protests, because only when protests do not get the sufficient amount of attention or attention from the higher authorities, only it is then that is it goes into rioting. And throughout history, we have always seen that peaceful protests do not get the same amount of media coverage as riots. It is only when a lot of harm has been done that media have turned their policies into covering these instances. Hence, riots already draw more attention. So in this way, in no way it reduces the effectiveness of the protests. And now, with I would like to say that riots also emerge because of a deep-seated anger that is already within the society. So, because of this George Floyd protests, it was not an effect. It was not a sudden aggressive act. It is something that it is because of a cumulative act of injustices towards Black people in America that has been happening for centuries. And and at the end, I would like to finish my speech by pointing out to the first speaker. He said that the Indian independence was because of peaceful protests. Well, I would like to point out that the Quit India movement ended in 1945, and it was eventually because of the Navy rebellion and the armies that the British actually decided to leave India, and thus India gained its independence. Well, thank you.
All right. With that being said, we will pause for a moment because of a small technical difficulty. All right, we're back.
Let's see. Let's.
Okay. So what we'll so we were waiting for Ishan to recognize questions on this speech.
We'll take Anirudh and Arav.
I
So,
couldn't
are you mentioned in
correct
your speech that
me.
rioting will draw government attention? So, because government attention has been drawn, they will be compelled to suppress the protest. So, don't you think a peaceful protest at a first place would be more effective than a protest being stopped by the government?
Well, I believe that almost every protest that has been in recent times that started as peaceful measures. It is only when they did not get the right amount of attention or the response or the reciprocation from the government that it turned violent or because of police resistance. And it will, but the peaceful protests, they were already not getting enough attention from the government. So if that turned violent, at least the government knows about the deeds. And well, I clearly mentioned about media coverage and not about the attention from the higher authorities. So that question doesn't really stand.
Okay. Thank you. Um, who had the next question? Arav.
Yeah, I
Go
had a
on.
question. So, in your speech, you mentioned that protests turn violent because of insufficient attention that is given to these protesters. So, do you think just for the sake of attention, it is worth it to start protests which will injure more people than what originally started from as the protests? So, do you think it is worth looting buildings? It is worth police injuring people? It is worth causing lots of property damage? So how do you justify that?
Can you rephrase your question? Like, can you just tell it again?
So you said that governments that protests often turn violent once if these protesters aren't given much attention, right? So do you think just for the sake of attention, it is worth it for it is worth a lot of property getting damaged? It is worth is arson worth it? Is property damage worth it? Is injuring people worth it as a result just for the sake of attention?
Well, for most of the injuries that have or the fatalities, it has been seen that the protests turned violent because of the resistance that was provided by the military or the police, and that was from the authorities itself. And well, I talked about media coverage. Most of the peaceful protests, they don't get enough media coverage, and when it turns violent, media get at least what they're trying to say. Well, at least for the sake of like the thing that happened with George Floyd, it's about injustice, not was one person, but amongst an entire race that had been getting subjugation for centuries. Well, for that matter, I would say it's totally worth it if we are standing for the right movement.
Right. Now, with that being said, we will be moving on to the next speaker. Seeing as all the questions have been asked and answered, which means the next speaker will be Pradyum. Pradyum, are you there?
Yeah.
Okay, you have 4 minutes on the clock. Go ahead.
Okay, so when does a protest become effective? A protest becomes effective when it wins the support of the party being protested to, and when every party, not only the protesting party, realizes that the protest makes sense, have meaning, have cause, and not only the protesting party, but every party on the media and every party subject to the protest realize that the protest can be carried on because the protests have meaning and the protests just don't ask for a nonsensible change. Now, understand that peaceful protests, that is, protests which do not involve rioting and outright violence, are more inclusive and understandable. Today, in a protest, there is the cause and then there's the execution. The cause may be good, but the execution defines how the protest is received, how meaningful the protest is, and whether the protest shall go on. Today, you may have a good cause, but if you make the protest violent, the protest is a violent protest, it's rioting. Nobody looks at the cause anymore. Thus, when you pose it as a riot, it becomes a riot, and all of us know that today people are easily convinced, are more relatively easily convinced to start a protest rather than a riot. Cause may be good, but execution defines what the protests are. Violently, it looks like a revolution. It may not be a revolution, but it takes the form of a revolution because there is violence, there is burning of cities, there is arson. So the cause of the protest is easily lost. Now, if the protest starts to look like a revolution, there will be less people joining the protest. That is implied. So we know that if less people are joining the protest, if less people are wanting to protest, then the protest won't be as effective as it would be. Today, it is tougher to convince people to start a riot than it is to convince people to start a protest. That is a fact. So understand that now the first speaker of the opposition came ahead and said beheadings of kings have been posed as peaceful protests. Now, when he talks about kings, that just denotes how outdated his argument is. He has posed us examples from decades ago, saying how rebellions and protests have been effective. But today, understand that people appreciate peaceful protests more than they appreciate violence. Today, there are international peace organizations which know that peaceful protests are more effective than riots, because riots just makes it an issue of peace rather than change. When you riot, then what the UN will do is the UN will want peace in the country. The change is forgotten, the cause is forgotten. So if you're posing an example where violence decreases the effectiveness, increases the effectiveness of the protest, it just increases attention as posed by the second speaker of the opposition. But that does not mean that increases effectiveness, because effectiveness means change and not necessarily intervention. So when you say that violence allows us to express the change we want, but that is not true. Today we know that the government appreciates words rather than violence. If you burn up a city and then you say, sorry, my cause was that I don't want racism, then the government doesn't care about that. The government cares about the fact that you burned up a city, not that you want racism. Today we know that these racist protests make sense. We want a change in the system. But some of us are also saying that, including Mr. Donald Trump, when the looting starts, the shooting starts, then the effectiveness of the protest simply gets reduced. And now the second speaker of the opposition said that protests lead to a riot, and that is how riot makes the protest effective. Taking these Floyd protests simply, we knew that this was a movement against racism, but now this has become a safety issue. This has become a issue about safety in America. This has become an issue about security in America. It has moved on from an issue about racism. This has become about the government, and simply no change will be introduced because now this has become a conflict, not a protest. Thus, rioting simply leads you away from the road you plan to take with the protest. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions in that speech. Rana, followed by Shiva.
Yeah. Sir, during the beginning of your argument, you stated that once riot starts, all people care about is the riot and the cause is completely taken out of it. And from the case study which you have pointed out, let us do look at the George Floyd protests. There have been a few riots in a few places, but due to these riots, do you believe that now, because of these riots, black lives don't matter?
So we are saying that, so we know that black lives do matter, but we are also saying that this protest is becoming ineffective because it is simply leading to burning of cities. Thus, we are placing more emphasis on how the revolution is being carried out rather than why the revolution is carried out. We know that black lives matter, but today we place emphasis on how the protests are being carried out. That's become a headline. Black Lives Matter has become a headline, but the way the protests are being carried out, that is gaining more attention from the media and getting this has become an issue of security. Subsequent.
Okay, sir.
Shan, may I ask a question?
After Singer.
Oh,
Singer.
Right. So, sir, in your speech, you talked about how the government want to listen to words and not to military protests. So, let us actually argue with words in the hope that they will listen to us. So, firstly, that is what the earliest type of nationalists in the Congress thought the government will listen to words, let us argue with words, and we saw what fruit they bore. Even recently, there have been several protests before the lockdown in India, protests with words, as you say, and we have seen how much of fruit they have actually yielded. So when we see that our the intention of our protests is to overthrow the existing regime, why do you think that the government will listen to words that say, okay, let's overthrow the existing regime, and say, okay, we want to listen to their words, let us just step aside? Because that is not how it works.
So, firstly, nobody said that protests have to mean overthrow of the regime. Protests may be change and majorly are about change rather than overthrow of the regime. If a government will listen to protests about change, it will not listen to protests about overthrowing of the regime, because simply overthrowing of the regime does not come under protesting. It comes under rebellion. It comes under revolution. And you spoke and you posed the example of the early nationalists. Now, the peaceful protests simply don't mean that you just go around saying that we want change. Yes, shouting is allowed. Yes, imposing of banners is allowed. But that riots, what does not come under riots is that there is no violence. So protests, if they carry no violence, then they are not riots. The early nationalists did not protest. They only protested with resolutions, and that cannot be classified as protest, because they didn't really want change. They just presented whatever paperwork they wanted. But then nationalists like Mahatma Gandhi, they have taken to peaceful protests. They were non-violent, so they were not riots, but they still brought about change. Thus, the example of the early nationalists does not stand, and the example we should be taking is example of nationalists like Mahatma Gandhi. Thank you.
Right. So, sir, did he imply in his answer that there is no connection between a riot and a protest, that riots are not essentially protests?
So,
That's for like whatever you want to interpret.
Right, fine, moving on.
So Yanch,
Right. While again, I ignore the opposition's again brutal misrepresentation of actual factual events. I would like to ask you, Pradyum, um, why do you think that it is this people that are to blame for these riots? Because if we actually backdate how these George Floyd riots actually started, it started after a police officer choked an innocent dark skinned man to death by putting his knee on his neck. That is first. And while your example about riots being, escalated by the people, do you not realize that the people are not just rioting over racism? The people are rioting because of how brutally the state is treating them. During the riots in itself, an elderly man at the age of
Suryansh,
right, I would like to ask him for a justification about this. I would like to take this example. An elderly man had been thrown to a concrete floor and he bled to death as the policeman who pushed him watched. Now, how do you justify the state being in the correct here and rioters being in the wrong, because this man only came to ask the police officer for directions to his home?
thank you for the emotional expression of your question, sir. So today, I never blamed the people who are rioting. Today, my job is to prove that riots reduce the effectiveness of the protests. Now, it may be morally justified for the riots to take place. That is not under the scope of the debate. It may be morally justified. What we are debating is whether the effectiveness of protest is reduced through riots, and today we know that it has been reduced because it has become an issue about American safety rather than racism.
okay. Pradyum, just a quick question I have for you. You talked about state after a particular riot, after violence taking place. Uh, the state won't see whether the change is brought about. The state will look forward to security, right? Whether law and order is upheld in that particular state, right? That's what you implied in your speech. But let's take the case of George Floyd, where the state is, the state is the wrongdoer here. But the state has certain laws placed, certain laws in place, and wherein a particular branch of the state itself, the police, has did what the police did. How do you and the public became the aggrieved party here. So how do you put that mechanism into effective parlance, saying that okay, the state will look at law and order in this case, wherein the state itself has did the initiating act to
So your
destroy.
question is that the state will not look at law and order predominantly, even if peaceful protests are carried out.
My question was, let's take the example of George Floyd. Okay, when the initiating act of destruction of law and order, okay, was carried out by the state itself, what authority or what right does the state have to maintain law and order in that particular state of chaos after the consequences it bears of the act itself has done?
So there is always an incentive for the state to act in accordance with the wants of the people, because today we know that the President Trump is not listening and is not caring about the welfare of the people and the reason for these protests. Now his approval ratings have also dropped. So the incentive for the state to coincide with the system of law and order is that the state cannot stay there forever. It can be elected out. That is what democracy is about.
Okay, yeah, let's move on.
Right. Okay, so thank you, Pradyum, and thank you to everyone who asked their questions and for your answers, Pradyum. So we will now be moving on to the next speaker, which is the final speaker for the proposition, which is Ave Tulsian. Ave, are you with us?
What, I won't
It
speak or what?
was it was Ranak.
Oh,
It
right,
was-
right. I apologize. It is Ranak who will be speaking now for the proposition. My apologies. Ranak, you have the floor for the next 4 minutes. Go.
Riots make protests less effective. So over here, the only bone of contention over here is to just look at effectiveness. We are not here to judge what is right, what is wrong, if non-violence is right, if eye for an eye is right. We are not here to judge any of it. We are just here to look at it at its face. Do riots make protests more effective or do they not? As Shinjoy has already pointed out, the extremism of the topic itself. So if the opposition can bring up even one example where riots have made protests more effective, the motion will fall. I would obviously, as most of the speakers have, would like to point to the case of George Floyd. So looking at this case, we have seen that riots have broken out. Riots have broken out, yes, but now look at us. Over here, all of us have brought out this example because of riots. Our entire attention is pulled towards it. Notice how none of us have talked about the currently ongoing Hong Kong protests as well. Those are completely peaceful, but it never gets the same attention by the media. Why? Because of riots. So yes, riots do increase the media attention, which can in turn lead to an increase in effectiveness. Now, what is effectiveness? A protest will obviously want to bring in reforms. Now, if we look at American history, there have been only 2 points in time where large-scale reforms, large-scale progressive reforms for black men have been brought out. One is 1968 and one is now, 2020. Both in 1968, the protests and subsequent riots were led out by the death or rather assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. And yes, multiple progressive reforms came out for black people, and even now, already in about, I think, 10 days since Mr. Floyd's death and the subsequent riots and protests, laws and changes have already been brought out. In Minnesota, it is now illegal to neck hold choke by police officers on any person. So, and that is the same in California and Tennessee. And such reforms are being brought out immediately. That is because of the riots which have brought this attention to the protests. Look at all the other Black Lives Matter protests in the USA. Protests have been continuing since the turn of the century. Since 1968, there have been Black Lives Matter protests till 2020. But only 2 such protests have been able to bring about actual meaningful change for this community. And those were the 1968 protests and the 2020 protests. The only thing common were riots. Without riots, protests lose its meaningfulness. Let us look at most protests. We see tons of candlelight marches. We see tons of vigils going out. But as common citizens, as consumerist citizens, we look at this piece of news and we're like, oh, okay, it's just another protest. Nothing puts the protest out of other protests. We are desensitized by the idea of protest itself. Unless there is something unique, there is something radical in the protest, we never take protest seriously. And the radical element which has been introduced and which we are talking about today are riots. These days, you cannot take protests seriously without riots. I would like to end my speech there. Thank you.
Right. Ranak, you have a minute remaining. Would you like to continue, or is that it?
No, I would like to end it there.
Right. With that, Ishan, questions on
Yeah.
the speech?
Any questions on the floor? Okay, Anirudh, Ave.
Sir, as you mentioned about the George Floyd case, sir, don't you think that there was these social media protests that brought effectiveness more than any other thing?
So the problem which we are facing is it's very difficult to judge what is bringing change and what is not. So you would obviously have to take a case study of two cases, see if they have brought change or not, and look at the point of differentiation. Now, in 2008, a few Black Lives Matter protests did break out in Missouri because of a police brutality case against a young teenager. Now, all of them were peaceful, but they could not bring any substantial change to any Missouri laws. But now, if you look at these protests, the only difference which has happened, you could say, are riots. But in case of riots, there has been change. There has been effective change taken out in multiple states, and this change is still going. So from that, we can conclude that yes, riots have brought on this change.
May I ask my question now?
Yeah, carry on. I think Ishan is listening.
Okay. So my question is that you made this assumption that an increase in media attention increases the effectiveness of protests. Sir, don't you believe that when there is a riot, the type of media attention the protest is getting and the media narrative is such that it reduces the effectiveness of the protest?
Again, I think I would go with the same answer as if talking strictly about effectiveness, the only way we can judge if it has been effective or not is by comparing to other protests. Media attention towards this protest has been different towards the 2008 protests. But let's look at the change. I do believe that there has been much more legislative change this time around in the 2020 protests. Because the thing with riots is that the moment riots come into the play, let's not talk about media attention. Let's just talk about the magnitude. Let's not talk about the type of media attention, but the magnitude of media attention. So due to riots, this protest has gotten much more media attention. It's all over the world. Everybody knows about it. And I do believe that us consumers are also individual consumers. So once we get to know about this particular protest, which has been only magnified to the scale of riots, we can then study about the protest ourselves and judge for ourselves whether it has been effective or not and whether the riots are required or not.
Right.
Because without riots, we would not have gotten to know about this in the first place.
I had a question as well. Could I answer that? Could I ask a question, Suryansh?
I am not the judge of that. Ishan? I think
Yeah.
Ishan. Yeah.
Could I ask this question?
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. So in your speech, you mentioned.
Just a second.
Oh,
I think it was Ave's turn.
Ave answered this question.
Avar's question was answered.
Right. So could I ask my question now?
Yeah, carry on.
Yeah. So in your speech, you mentioned that an effective measure or something, an effective change from these protests has been the banning of neck holds in certain states, right? So you do realize that banning a method of banning a method of restraining prisoners is not fixing racism. It is not bringing about effective change to what these protests actually are about. These protests are about black lives being mattered all around the world and in America. So, do you think banning neck holds is a way of saying that racism is fixed? There is no more racism in America.
Sir, obviously, to change the mindset of an entire community, it would require much more prolonged change. A sudden outburst can never change the mindset of the community. But would you not agree with me that even some degree of change in legislation, some degree of change in rules is a positive step towards changing the mindset?
Right.
Right. Thank you, Rana.
Yeah.
Let's move ahead.
Yeah. So yeah, we'll move on to the final speaker of the proposition now, conclusively, which is Abhay Tulsian. Abhay, are you with us?
Yeah, may I begin?
Yeah, go ahead.
So, one of the primary things the opposition's argument is based on is that today's motion is absolute. Ladies and gentlemen, unless a motion has the word always or in every case in it, it's not absolute. Today's motion means that in general, rioting reduces the effectiveness of protest. On average, rioting reduces the effectiveness of protest. Now, let's start with Srinjoy's speech. The first, his speech was based on the fact that riots and rebellions are essentially the same thing, or rebellions are a type of riots. But sir, your entire speech was based on historic examples. You kept talking about riots and rebellions which have happened in the past. But the motion here is that rioting reduces the effectiveness of protest. Today we are talking about the present tense, and today in today's world, rebellions don't really happen very often. The majority of riots, the majority of protests in the world today are against a particular policy, and to enact policy changes in the government and not to create a change in the entire government. So I believe your argument there falls, because your entire argument is based on rebellions being violent and hence effective. You also spoke about the women's suffrage movement and said just because the women's suffrage movement employed rioting, and the women's suffrage movement in your eyes was a success, therefore rioting is effective. Sir, just because a particular tactic was employed by them doesn't mean that the movement was successful specifically because of that tactic. When I asked you this question, you said that I should read an article by the Guardian which says that this was one of their most important tactics, but you have not established a connection between the fact that they rioted and the fact that their protests were successful. Moving on to the second speaker, he said that only when protests do not get attention do they turn violent, and since protests emerge out of riots emerge out of protests, they cannot be effective. I don't understand how he jumped from riots emerging out of protest to riots being ineffective, to riots being effective as a result of emerging out of protest. But sir, riots turn violent not just because they're not getting attention. They turn violent because people have a deep-seated anger, because people need to express that anger. And you said that since people do not want to destroy their own communities, they won't riot unless it's necessary. I'd like to respond to that by saying that people think that rioting is necessary. People think that unless they riot, nobody will listen to them. And I believe that this thought itself is unfounded, because when someone uses violent means, they end up shuttering out an entire portion of the community which otherwise might have supported them. If you are engaging in a particular protest and it's a peaceful protest, then people around the community can support you. But if you're engaging in a violent protest, then people will say, okay, I agree with the message which this guy might be trying to say, but I cannot support these protests because I cannot condone this sort of violence. And you are excluding a part of the community simply by engaging in such violent acts. The Another one of the primary points of the opposition is that riots get more coverage from the media, and that is true. Obviously the media will give more coverage to riots and to violent acts, but this is not the right type of coverage which a protest should get. When media is covering protests which have turned violent, then the media starts debating whether or not violence is okay in a protest, rather than debating the actual concept behind the protest. The attention of the people who are looking at the television screen and looking at the news channels shifts from hashtag Black Lives Matter to is the method in which they're protesting okay? Is this method acceptable? The attention is drawn
Abhay,
away
wrap up.
the topic of the protest, and it goes towards the method of the protest, and that is why I believe that that is
Abhay, wrap up.
to propose. Thank you.
All right. With that, we will now be taking questions on our speech. Ishan.
Shinjoy and Rana.
Shinja, you're muted.
My bad. Sir, I have a twofold question for you. Firstly, you stated that the topic is not an absolute topic because the word always does not exist. So my question for you is simply, is this statement statement, the sun rises in the east, absolute or not? And for the second part of my question, you stated that I only that rebellions are a thing of historic examples only, and they don't happen currently. But so the list of countries which currently have separatist movements include Algeria, Angola, Cameroon, Central African Republic, Comoros, Democratic Republic of Congo, Egypt, and I could go on and on. And also countries like Bangladesh have received freedom by violent means in as late as the later half of the 20th century.
I
So how
got
do you
your point.
justify
May I
these points?
respond? Yes. So the difference between the sun rises in the east and this house believes that rioting reduces the effectiveness of protests is that one is a fact and one is a belief. So when you state a fact, it is absolute. When you state a belief, it is not absolute. There can be exceptions. That's the difference between a fact and a belief. I suggest you get that straight. You also brought up that there are several separatist movements going on around the world right now. That is true. There are separatist movements, but you need to understand that back at the time which you were talking about through your examples, almost every riot, almost every protest going on was against the government because the government was a monarchy, the government was autocratic, and people were going on and on about why they should remove that government and change that government. Today, yes, there are some movements, some revolutions against governments, but overall, in most countries around the world and in most protests which are taking place, they are protests against a particular policy. They are protests against
That's
what the
fair.
government is doing rather than the existence
Thank
of the
you.
government in the first place.
Okay. And before anything, I would like to give this special mention to Shinja Sen for this amazing little, the way he read from the screen was absolutely amazing, Shinja. I loved it. Absolute. It was lovely. Anyways, let's move on.
Actually,
Rana.
just to clarify, did Ave state that yes, it might work in some countries, but I believe it doesn't work overall? Is that the crux
No,
of his
that's
argument?
not what I said. Let me clarify what I said. I think you
No,
misheard.
sir.
Dude,
I have
that's what I
understood
said.
what you've meant to say. Shinja, it's open to interpretation.
Of course, everything is
Rana.
open to
No,
interpretation.
I'd just like to clarify. Give me 10
Two
seconds.
sentences.
Oh,
That's
Yeah,
it.
2 sentences. The point which I was trying to make is that in general, in the current world scenario, most protests are against a policy, and back then it was mostly a protest against the existence of the government in general. So since the type of protest
One.
has changed, yeah, that was first sentence.
He keeps using conjunctions. That's
Current
not allowed.
scenario, the
Exactly,
type of protest
exactly.
is
Give him a
different.
number
The
of words,
methods
10
which will be
words.
employed are also different. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Brilliant.
Thank-
Rana. The
Ronak has left.
Ranak. Okay, Ranak left. Wow. Powerful speech indeed. Okay. So should we wait for him or should we move
I
on
think we'll
to
pause for a
man
second.
of the debate?
Everybody.
Yeah.
So yeah.
All right.
what-
With that, Ishan Ranak had internet issues, so he has been removed from. He has to remove himself from the meeting. But to conclude his part of the debate, he has sent me his question. So may I ask it for him?
Yeah, definitely.
So from what I interpreted, Ranak would like to ask you, Ave, that how can you provide any amount of substantial examples that suggest that protesting without riots are equal to protests with riots, and like have had the same effect or more or less. He wants you to prove it with an actual case study.
Sir, simply by comparing whether one riot was effective and whether another riot was effective, you cannot boil down that correlation to a causation. You cannot say that, oh, this riot worked and it had violence in it, that riot didn't work in your opinion, and that one was peaceful. Therefore, violence is better than peacefulness when it comes to rioting. We cannot establish a causation in this. It is solely a topic which we can ideate and discuss in an abstract way.
Right, Ranak is back.
Not prove a causation without some sort of controlled system, and it's not possible to have a controlled system in the case of a riot.
Did you
Thank you
not
so
have
much
one
for that.
example that supported your cause? Not even one?
Shinja.
I have
Stop.
examples,
Hey,
sir, but
Ave,
I don't
no
believe
cross talk.
examples can I
Just a
don't
second.
believe examples can
Just a second.
adequately
Hey, I'm demarking,
as
not pro.
arguments, unlike
What
what
is this?
sir.
Ishan,
Oh God, what happened?
what? Ishan, just to clarify, he said he has examples, but he won't use them.
Just to
The
clarify, just to
example
I
clarify.
said,
to
I'll
name.
clarify what I said, Suryansh.
Aware, no
Said that there
clarifications.
are
You won't be the elephant in the room. Shut up.
two sentences. No,
Next.
he's misinterpreting.
Could I speak a bit? It was my question.
Yeah, Rana, go ahead.
Pro.
Wait, Ishan, you're
Oh man, I'm sorry
Who
for this
was the
guy.
demark directed towards, Ishan?
Okay. Ranak,
Actually, the
All
question was
right,
asked.
go on.
The question's
Go
already
on.
been asked. Ranak's question's already been asked.
Exactly. It's already been
Suryansh,
asked.
please send Avya to the waiting room.
Ranak, Ranak, say it again. Say it again.
Wait,
Just
wait.
Ishan's
Aware,
yeah.
I'll give you 20
Uh,
seconds if you have anything to add to what you said. 20
no,
seconds.
I would.
yes.
Could I
So
not
what
just
I'd like to
like
add
all I would
is
like to say is that like you need examples to basically validate your ideology. Like the entire opposition has given examples of how riots have been effective. So unless you can give examples of how non-rioted protesters have also been effective, how can you claim that it's actually good in
okay,
real life?
fine,
It
fine,
sounds
fine.
good on
Thank you
paper
for
also.
okay, all right. I got your question. Thanks for the question. You can take examples of Tiananmen Square. You can take the example of non-violent protests carried out by Gandhi, such as the Dandi March. But my point is that there's always going to be examples of violent protests being successful and unsuccessful, non-violent protests being unsuccessful and successful. You cannot compare the two simply by using examples. You have to ideate and have an ideological discussion, which is what I'm trying to do. I've given you my examples. There are examples on both sides. Examples are not the way to solve this debate. Thank you.
Brilliant. Okay. Let's move forward. Suri, man of the hour. Let's hear you out. Okay.
Right.
Wait, I'll
So,
time you. Wait.
yeah, please time me. Yes,
Not
I am not prepared at all, but okay.
stopwatch. Okay.
Right.
3, 2, 1. We can begin.
Right. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to start make my case here by not just putting forward my points, but by bringing to the notice of this floor that not only has the proposition provided incorrect defenses, but also contradicted their own statements with their blasphemy in terms of examples. I will point this out. I would like to bring your attention to the disaster that was the example of Arav and the Tiananmen Square. Tiananmen Square was successful. They were not just martyrs. Ladies and gentlemen, those in Tiananmen Square were honored because the leader, the next communist leader after the leader during the Tiananmen Square massacre was pressured by the public and the international community to make changes to their economy and lift China up, and it worked. Now, ladies and gentlemen, coming to the fact about the George Floyd example, I would also show you this book. This book called Blink by Malcolm Gladwell. Now, it has a very common principle highlighted called unconscious adaptiveness. Now, what is that? Within a blink, quote, of an eye, the individual realizes that this is wrong or this is right subconsciously. Now, in this scenario, I would blink and realize that racism is wrong. Police battery for no reason whatsoever is wrong. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if I am being attacked, I will defend myself. These people in the George Floyd massacre, the brutal killing of George Floyd massacre, they have rioted not just because of racism. It is because of how the people are being treated. The people want fair opportunity and fair reason to express themselves and not be choked to death for 9 minutes straight. Now, with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, I would also like to highlight the fact about another elderly man who was pushed down by police officers for simply trying to ask for directions. And why? Because he was a black man. And ladies and gentlemen, both these police officers, when they were interviewed, said that he was black and he had a very hostile demeanor. Now, what hostile demeanor means, I do not understand, but I believe he had a fair reason to express himself. The video was also online, which has gone viral recently. And with that being said, I would also like to give the define for you what a protest really is. A protest is a public objection, expression of objection, of disapproval towards an idea or a course of action, usually proposed by the state. Now, a riot is when a public demonstration turns violent and the peace is disturbed by the crowd. Now, why was there a riot? It is because the peace was first disturbed by the state itself, ladies and gentlemen. The people are in public objection because their human rights, their international the international law that states the people require a certain set of rights are being violated, ladies and gentlemen. The government has been elected to help the people, and these people take it, and the state is doing the opposite of it. Ladies and gentlemen, the people are rioting not because they feel it necessary and they just hate the government for no reason whatsoever. It is because the government has taken blows against them. Now, with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, I would also like to bring out more misrepresentation of facts in the shape of Anirudh Chaudhary. Anirudh Chaudhary with his example of Mahatma Gandhi and his example, which I had called out earlier as well. I would also like to bring up the situation. I would like to conclude my argument by bringing to the attention of the floor that riots do help protest. And why do they help protest? It is because at first the people protest, and when it is not successful, when the government does not recognize what they have said, when the government does not fail to see the validity of their argument, when the government does not see that the people who have elected them do disagree and do not make a change, they riot. And they riot for that change, and change is what is necessary when it is incorrect in the eyes of the people. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Suryansh. Any questions? We will have Aware and Pradeep.
Okay, so my question to you is, Suryansh, that the primary part of your speech was based on why rioting and using violence as a form of protest is justified. Don't you believe that whether or not it's justified is outside the scope of the debate, and we only need to discuss whether or not it's effective?
Abhay, now considering this is a debate, I must not only provide examples to support my stance. What I must do is, correctly justify them with accurate examples, unlike what the opposition has done. Now, why I did justify this, even though it is not in the purview of the debate, is simple. The proposition has constantly questioned the opposition about whether this is about the validity of their argument. So I justified it with my own examples, and I simply said that if the state is taking actions against the people, are the people supposed to stand defenseless? Are the people supposed to stand and wait as they are slapped in the face? No. That is simple.
Pradeep?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So the very today we all know that Black Lives Matter. Today we all know what happened to George Floyd, and no action was taken. Not a lot of legislative action was taken after that. Is not at all justified. It was wrong of what happened to George Floyd. But the very fact doesn't the very fact that you had to justify it for us again, taking a majority of your speech, doesn't that denote that riots have made the protests ineffective? Because you had to spend a lot of time trying to justify it.
I spent maybe firstly, Pradyum, before I answer your question, it's not just Black lives that matters, it is all lives that matter. That is first. Now, I spent two sentences. I don't know if that is a lot, but if two sentences is a lot, okay. I spent a lot of time justifying George Floyd because, the opposition has misrepresented facts and, tried to undermine the premise of the riots and, undermine the rioters the protesters for them trying to them trying to justify their own rights. Now, I do not believe as a human being, and I don't know if you believe as a human being, that one should have to tell the government that we deserve rights. I don't believe that the government should be told, treat us all equally. I do not believe that is correct. and which is why I spent those two sentences, which I don't know if you think is a lot, justifying why the rioters are in the right and why the state who took the first action against them in 1999 was wrong, and then moving on to why it was wrong in 2020.
Thank you. So, Yansh, that was indeed a good speech. Let's move on to the last speech for today.
Right.
That is
Anirudh Chaudhary, who is the proposition speaker, the final proposition speech wrapping up. Anirudh, you had 2 minutes left. Are you with us?
Okay. So the entire debate, the opposition has confused the topic. Sir, please try to understand there is a difference between something being effective and something increasing or reducing the effectiveness of something. For example, a tie is not effective unless and until it is worn over a shirt. It then only it affects a person's looks. For example, a riot may be effective, but it does not increase the effectiveness of a protest. For example, the women's suffragette movement or the George Floyd case, the fact that they needed to resort to rioting, it points to one fact, that the protest wasn't effective, and that is why they needed to take the cushion of rioting. So by saying this, I have clearly pointed fallacies in all the arguments of side opposition. Moving on, if a rebellion causes a certain amount of impact to the British Raj, and a similar amount of impact is caused by a peaceful salt march, definitely we should resort to that salt march, because it does not cause loss of lives. If second speaker of side opposition clearly said that media attention media attention is required for the success of a protest. Similarly, if a protest gains media attention, similarly in the same place, simultaneously it gains government attention, and the government will be compelled to suppress that riot, and the protest will stop at the first place, so it won't create any effect. And moving on, he also said that injuries are justified to bring change. So moving on, he basically says that loss of lives are required to bring about certain change. But if that change can be brought about by peaceful protests, I think that is what we should resort to. Thank you. With this, I'm very proud to do this.
Ishan, thank you for ending at the pinpoint time. Anirudh, Ishan, question.
Suryansh,
Even I have a question. My camera isn't working, so I can't raise my hand physically.
I think I'll take one question for this speech. I think.
Oh God, Shinjoy.
Okay, let's go for Ranak this time. Ranak?
No, you've been taking 3 questions for many speeches.
Arey,
Take
give
three
it
over
to
yours.
Shinjoy. He'll bug me about this later. Bhai, okay, diye de. I don't want to take this question. Shinjoy, you have my.
Oh, what
Again.
is this? Correct? Okay.
Oh.
How about we make a compromise, Suryansh?
Suryansh, go ahead.
Oh, lovely, it worked. Okay, so yes, Anirudh, throughout your speech, you mentioned why should people
Sir,
should
I
not.
can't hear you.
Oh, right. Can you hear me now, Anirudh?
Suryansh, I can't hear you.
Anirudh's channeling his inner Ronak and
Suryansh,
leaving the
I can't hear
meeting.
you. Could you please repeat?
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
All right. Now I hope my question doesn't blow your internet away. So, I would like to ask you that throughout the 2 minutes that you just had, you tried to justify why people should not resort to rioting, which wasn't under the purview of the debate. But anyhow, I would like to ask you why you think people should not to resort to rioting, because uh, it does increase the effectiveness after the examples I stated. And when
Suryansh,
okay, I'll precipitate it. Two sentences. You said rioters should not resort to rioting. I am asking you,
one.
why should they not resort to rioting? Because my sentence is not finished. Why they should not resort, considering considering the state has not done anything about it. The people are dissatisfied and have resorted to rioting because of how ineffective the state has been, and the state that has been appointed by the people itself.
So the debate, beyond debating about why we should resort to rioting or why we shouldn't resort to rioting, the topic of the debate clearly says that does rioting reduce the effectiveness of a protest? It clearly does not, because if we need to resort to rioting, it points to a fact that the protest wasn't successful, it wasn't effective. That's why we have taken the question of rioting. So if we need to resort to rioting, it clearly defeats the purpose of protests. Thank you.
Okay, I'll give
Since Ronak
Srinja
has
two
given,
sentences. Please make it brief, please, because Abhay has to leave, and you
right,
also have to leave. So just
you
fasten it.
also have to leave as in me.
Yeah,
Dude,
Srinja, even I
genuinely
have to leave. I have a
Can
class.
we
All
can
right.
we just
Okay.
end
Oh,
the
Ishan, I requested you please read the chat.
Okay, yeah.
I'm like
I
8
did.
minutes
I did.
Abhay
late.
has expressed my views in one sentence.
Acha, bro.
I'm 8 minutes late to another meeting. I mean,
What is it about?
Just Srinja, make a compromise,
I'm
Yeah,
please.
teaching
fine.
a class, dude. It's
Okay.
No. I'll be
Okay,
very
okay.
fast. I'll be very fast. So you
no.
said that a salt march is better than a riot because if they have the same impact, there will be less lives lost. But that is simply not true, because in the salt march, even though you may claim it was peaceful, many lives were lost because the British lathi charged many harmless, unarmed Indians. So when lives are being lost in both cases, and both cases according to you have the same impact, why do you think that a salt march is way more preferable? That was fast.
So, considering the number of lives lost in the rebellion as compared to the number of lives lost in the salt march, and you know that number of lives lost in the salt march was comparatively lesser than the number of lives lost in the rebellion. So that is the reason I think we should resort to salt march rather than a rebellion.
Okay. Thank you. I think we came to an end of this debate.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Well, with that being said, I mean, that was quite the fun-filled debate, or action-packed, if I may, debate that we had. I mean, I hope all of you all enjoyed. I sure did. I hope, Ishan, you were satisfied with the
Yeah,
debate.
I definitely was. If you give me just 2 minutes, I'd reflect my thoughts. Just two
Yeah.
minutes. Yeah, I won't take much of Abhay's time or anyone's time.
Will we have the question for the house in
No,
this
no, no,
debate?
no, no,
No,
not
not today, not today.
no, not today. Okay, so I felt today the proposition could carry forward the motion really, really well and better than the opposition. I feel that the burden of proof was on the opposition today, and they have executed it amazingly, but it was the proposition who took it home. I like to point out a few things. Amazing. Uh, Absolutely amazing when you talked about basically, see, this is what any judge would expect out of a debate. Okay, out of a debater. Number one, you recognize a stakeholder. Okay. After you recognize a stakeholder, what did Avay go on to say? Avay went on to say that, see, boss, writing makes protests or things unpredictable. It is shifting your thing from the shifting focus from the actual cause. Right? Am I audible? Yeah, so it is shifting your focus on the actual cause. What is happening? Most of the people talked about media coverage. What is the media doing? The media is completely focusing on acha, exactly what he said. You're shifting it from things. You're shifting it to the actual scenes of violence and rioting, etc. And another good thing that he pointed out was that it gives the opposition, the actual opposition, the chance to pinpoint that, okay, yeah, we believe in the protest, but we do not believe in what they're doing. We do not believe in the looting. We do not believe in the shooting. Right. So it gives the opposition a chance to, yeah, to condemn you. So I felt aware it was a very tight speech, amazing speech. And from the opposition, I felt it was Srinjoy who took it home. Absolutely amazing speech, wherein he beautifully countered, the burden that the House bore on its shoulders by saying that change cannot be measured. Change should seem to be done. Right? It's absolutely necessary that okay, his point was basically riots due to this mass, mass uprising, this mass violence. What happens is riots aggrandize the purpose, the fundamental purpose of a particular change, right? It aggrandizes that purpose. And the thing is, without such an uprising or without such violence, which I expected the opposition to come up with, change is not, change cannot be brought about. Okay, and I thought Shinjoy did that like beautifully. He talked about how it should seem to be done. He talked about women's suffrage movements. He talked about the relation between rebellion, riots, how they are a part of protests, etc. Amazing. For the other speakers, most of you talked about revolution. Last thing I'll want to point out, a revolution is not this simple. Okay, for Pratyum, I think you talked about revolution the most. Revolution is not that simple. Revolution is not about that. Okay, you have a protest and that's revolution. Revolution has a lot of aspects to it. Economic, it has an economic aspect, a political aspect, it has a social aspect, it has so many things. So you can't say that okay, a revolution ho gaya. It's not a revolution. Revolution तभी होता है जब it's a total change in a society, total change in function. So yeah, that I won't take much of your time. I thought today the best speaker we have a tie between sides of the house. Amazing speech, guys. Round of applause for both
Ishan, we
these
missed it. Your
speakers.
internet was erratic,
Yeah,
and
we
we missed like
miss.
the names, and we heard first and good job.
Right. Hello.
Yeah, carry on.
Hello. Yeah. So, am I audible?
Yeah,
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
So today, the best speaker we have a tie. It's definitely Srinjoy and Abhay. I think beautiful speeches. Have a round
Enjoy,
of
my
applause.
brother.
Uh, I thought, yeah, they were the two best speakers, and
congrats.
at second we have the second best speaker as Pradyum. In fact, uh, Pradyum Nahata. And since like people have to go, that's why I cannot, I can't elaborate on where you went wrong. And we have a tie in the third position between Ranak Banerjee and Suryansh Basumalik. I felt Suryansh, just one thing, you really deviated from your topic a bit. You talked not about the effectiveness, you talked about health, you talked about other things a bit. Justification, I thought that was
Yeah.
not needed. But yeah, very good speech. It could have been more tight. You definitely have a lot to learn from this debate from Srinjoy, from Abhay, how they recognize stakeholders, how they dodge the burden of proof and everything. And yeah, it was a lovely debate. I witnessed a lot to learn, man. Amazing debate. Thank you so much.
Congrats, guys. All right. With that, good job to all of you. Thank you, Ishan, for coming in, and congratulations to everyone. And yeah, I expect to seeing. I hope all of you can be here again for the next debates we have each week. And I hope you all enjoyed. Is there anything you'd like to say before we wrap up? Right. Seeing as there's nothing else, well, I hope to see you all next time. And yeah, that's what that was. And yeah, take care, stay home, and stay safe.